guys, it's Angela Walters from Quilting is My Therapy, and welcome to week 3 of the Free-motion Challenge Quilting Along, Becoming Successful with Swirls and Pebbles. In this video, we're going to learn how to machine quilt pebbles, and then we're going to combine them with a concentric swirl that we learned last week. I'm going to show you how to do it on a sewing machine, as well as what it looks like on a long arm, and some fun variations that you can add to your quilt. So let's get to it. I'm guessing you probably know how the first step goes. You're going to quilt a circle. Now, it doesn't have to be perfectly circular. We're just going for roundish. When you go to quilt your next circle, you're going to quilt it in a different direction. My first one went counterclockwise, so my next one is going to go the opposite direction, and it's going to go clockwise. It's that change of direction that really helps those circles stay close to each other. If you started quilting them and you forgot to change direction, well, you would be completely normal because that happens all the time, but you're going to get something that looks like this. By quilting it in different directions, it's going to really help them stay close to each other and really fill in the space as completely as possible. Now there's one more thing that you have to think about. Besides quilting the circle and changing direction, you need to think about traveling. And traveling is quilting along a previously quilted line. But it's that traveling that's going to help you maneuver around. Now that may be the funniest joke that I ever tell, right? Go ahead and quilt a circle and then travel along it and quilt the same shape right on top of it. When you're thinking of traveling, try not to get overwhelmed by it. Think of it as a way to get to your next pebble. I'm not even worried about traveling over every single pebble. I'm just looking at where I need to add my next pebble and using traveling to get me there. Or if you get stuck and you're not sure where you're going, you might end up traveling around that circle a couple times. You know, it's kind of like a roundabout that you get on and you can't figure out how to get back off. Another thing that's common when you're learning a new design is you might end up with a gap in between your pebbles. If this happens, I'm going to work my way back in and fill it in because I think that people will notice a hole in the quilting before they notice an error. If that happens to you and you catch it in time, you can actually just travel along your previously quilted pebbles to get in there, fill it in with another circle, and then move right back on out. And then you won't even be able to see where that hole was. Now there are going to be some gaps in your quilting, and you can see right here I have a little bitty gap in between some of these pebbles. That's normal. As long as that gap is smaller than the pebbles, I'm fine and I'm going to leave it that way. Now something that happens all the time is that we kind of get caught into a repetitive motion. And here you can see all my pebbles are going in a line. I have that thread build up in the center. Well, what that means is I'm not traveling around enough and going in a bunch of different directions. So sometimes it might be helpful to think, okay, I'm going to give myself a new repetition to follow. I'm going to quilt a pebble and put one below it and to the left and below it and to the right. Whatever you have to say to make yourself go in a bunch of different directions, that's what's going to give you the best overall texture. Once you get the hang of those three things, quilting your circle, changing direction, and adding a little traveling, then it just comes down to practice. And I promise the more you practice, the easier it's going to get. Using a matching thread color will really help it blend into your quilt top. So if you have the coordinating thread collection, go ahead and use the color that matches your quilt top the most. That way you can get an idea of the overall texture. The great thing about pebbles though is that you don't have to commit to using them over the whole quilt. You can combine them with other designs, and it just so happens that we learned the concentric swirl design last week. So what we're going to do now is combine it with our concentric swirl and see what that looks like. Once you're finished with the swirl, but before you quilt your next one, go ahead and quilt a few pebbles. You can do 1 or you can do 20. It doesn't matter, just start quilting them right up next to your swirl. Once you've decided you've had enough, or you're about to pass out because you're not breathing anymore, go ahead and go right into quilting your swirl, starting with your little curl and echoing back out, stopping when you touch something. And in this instance, that happens to be another swirl. Travel and echo, and this time you're going to run into a pebble. What makes this a little bit tricky is if you want to add another echo line, that means you're going to have to travel along the pebble and then go into your echo. And that's what's really going to make those pebbles look like they're laying on top of the swirls. And I love the different textures right next to each other. So at this point, I can go ahead and quilt a few more pebbles. And then when I'm ready, I can go into my next swirl. This is also a great way to fill in those little gaps that might come up when you're quilting with those swirls. It's such a fun and easy way to fill up your space without committing to doing pebbles over the whole area. Now, just like we've been doing with the swirls, we can treat some of these dots as parts of our quilt that we want to show off. Using pebbles around something will really help draw attention to it. It's the perfect filler. It doesn't have any movement, it just has a beautiful texture, really flattening down whatever it's around. So what we could do is just quilt our pebbles right up next to it, leaving that dot unquilted, or by quilting a different thing in there, such as a swirl, which is a little less dense, really helping that pop out. Now I'm starting to quilt my pebbles around that dot. Normally I would fill in the whole area as I was working my way around, but for now I'm just going to give you an idea of what it looks like. You could either leave that dot unquilted or put something less dense like a big swirl in there to really help it stand out. And that different density is really going to help separate the two designs and make that dot really pop out. Of course, you could do the opposite. Instead of putting pebbles outside of that dot, you can put them inside, add a little echoing, and it's really going to draw attention to that area. So it's almost kind of the same thing. I'm traveling along the edge of that polka dot, starting a swirl, but instead of going into the center and working my way back, I'm going to close it off. And that's going to make this unquilted area separate whatever I put inside here from the filler outside of the dot. So I'm filling in that whole circle, but I'm making sure that I come back in the same area that I came in at, so that I can travel my way back on out and continue on quilting. Now, I think it's easier to learn 5 different ways to quilt a design than it is to learn 5 completely different designs. So besides combining it with swirls or using it as a way to highlight an area of your quilt, you can also change up the scale of your design. Instead of quilting your pebbles tiny and your swirls bigger, you can flip the script. You can start by quilting your pebbles a lot larger, think quarter size, and quilt your swirls smaller. It's the same basic idea, it's just going to give it a completely different look. Quilting the larger pebbles does go a lot faster, but it can be harder to travel around them, so it's kind of like a double-edged sword. Now, if you're quilting your pebbles on a bigger scale, you might run into an area where you don't have quite enough room to quilt that pebble. So what I like to do is just make it look like it's going behind whatever it is that I'm up close to. Okay, one last variation. Then I'll show you what it looks like on a long arm. Let's pretend that you're wanting to impress somebody, you know, like a Free-motion Challenge participant. You can quilt your swirls and put pebbles on the inside of them. It's going to start the same by quilting your little swirl, echoing back around until you touch something. Then I'm going to travel along that swirl and leave a little bit more space in between my echo lines. It's within this unquilted area that I'm going to add my row of pebbles, working my way around until I reach the other side. And then going right back into my echoing. And you don't even have to do this over a whole quilt. You can use this as a different texture to highlight your favorite fabric, to put in the border, or around that one thing you're really wanting to show off. Since it's the same shape as a regular swirl, it really fits in nicely. So you could try throwing one in here and there just to see what it feels like. So now that we've got a basic idea of how the pebble goes together, as well as some fun variations and applications of it, let's see what it looks like on the long arm. Now in the border sections of the quilt, I've played around with some different variations of this design. On one side, I've quilted it so that it looks like the pebbles turn into the swirls. This is such an easy thing to do. Start by quilting your pebbles, and then transition into your pebbles and your swirls combined, ultimately transitioning into just the swirls. It gives it this really cool, different effect, and I love to use it as an all-over design or in background areas of a quilt when I want to add a little bit of a different texture. And in this other side of the border, you can see where I did the same thing I did earlier, changing up the scale of the designs and quilting those pebbles a lot bigger and the swirls a lot smaller. All right, now it's your turn. Go ahead and fill in the area of your quilt with pebbles or with some of the variations, depending on how ambitious that you're feeling. Be sure to check out the description box below because I have links to quilting diagrams, tips for quilting pebbles, as well as where you can find out more about the Free-motion Challenge Quilting Along. Well, I'll see you next week when we learn how to quilt elongated swirls. Happy quilting!